The left talks a lot about money in politics, and they absolutely should. But we also have to talk about the power that the money outside of politics has, because that is the real way that the rich get what they want, no matter who comes to power. Now, of course, many politicians are themselves businessmen and businesswomen, and there's a disgusting trove of wealth that is spent in every election cycle. But to really understand why the government regularly favors the rich, we have to explain the structural bias towards capital. And this bias is why capitalism can never be compatible with democracy. Now, obviously the government, and what I'll more broadly call the state, makes political decisions for all of society. But at the same time, corporations and capitalists own all of the resources. This essentially means that if the state wants to carry out any program that benefits working people economically, those resources needed are probably already in private hands. In other words, redistributive legislation effectively involves the state asking capitalists to hand over their money. Now, this actually happens on a regular basis when it comes to taxes, but this arrangement produces horrendous results that puts profits over people's needs. Just look at what happened earlier this year in Argentina. During the explosion of the COVID crisis, the finance minister of Argentina, Martin Guzman, was engaged in high-stakes negotiations with the future of the Argentine economy weighing in the balance. He wasn't spending all of his time figuring out the best ways to protect people financially from this crisis. Instead, he was negotiating with international bondholders led by BlackRock, who were demanding payments despite the devastation of COVID to the economy. They wanted payments, but they also wanted assurances that the newly elected government, which was elected on a mandate of rejecting austerity, would not go too far to the left in their policy prescriptions. In a democratic society, what right should the rich have to dictate policies to governments? What right should the rich have to dictate policies to the representatives of the people? Capitalists simply don't want to be subjected to democracy, which is why they've spent decades creating international systems that essentially shield them from democratic rule. And they leverage their vast wealth to bring democratic governments to their knees. The sad thing is the Argentine crisis wasn't particularly extraordinary or unique. But let's get it right. These financial crises are crises of democracy. Now, there are plenty of examples of left governments having to bend. And look, a lot of these are political failures, strategy failures, yes. But these are also failures that are caused by material conditions. And it certainly happens here in the United States, and was a very real threat if Bernie Sanders was going to come to power. Let's really think through what that would mean. The state has a budget, and that budget needs to be financed via income. For the state, their income is tax revenue, and that taxation comes out of both personal income and corporate income. Those are based on economic growth and employment. Individuals can only pay their taxes if they're employed, and corporations can only pay their taxes if they're profitable and the economy is continuing to grow. It also needs to be mentioned that capitalists and their profitability are what determine who's employed and who's not. That means two things. The state's ability to do anything that requires managing or reallocating resources is structurally tied to the profitability of firms, and that capitalists have an informal veto power over political decisions. All individual capitalists, faced with the prospect of a left government, make a judgment on the profitability of their investments. If they aren't confident that they'll get the returns they want, they have a number of tools they can use that can undermine the ambitions of progressives and socialists in office. Chief among these are the capital strike and capital flight. The capital strike essentially is the ability of the capitalist class to withhold investment, essentially stop spending until they get conditions that are preferable to them. This puts us at a disadvantage, even with our democratic victories, turning those into positive policy outcomes. As long as we have the commanding heights of our society in private hands, we will be at a huge disadvantage. We have to build the political and social power that is necessary to challenge this inequity and include as part of our politics not just the demand that the rich pay their fair share, but that we're also going to chip away at a system of virtual deregulation and the unfettered movement of capital. And that brings us to the second major tool that capitalists use to attack democratically elected governments, and that's capital flight. And essentially what that means is moving money out of a country, a state, or region to find different conditions elsewhere. Think about what happens in the United States. Corporations get states to bid against one another, lowering taxes and eradicating workers' protections. This tactic has decimated organized labor and entire communities. It's not the only power that the rich have, but it is one of the major ways that the rich avoid the collective will of democracy. And you have to understand this, that the United States government not only knows this is going on, but they tolerate it. It's really important to note, especially in the case of the United States, it's not like all of this money that people talk about has moved to an offshore account. It's actually offshore. Rather, the legal entities just have their names changed and their registrations changed. And then that money flows right back into the United States to buy property and financial products. It's also invested, across all of the major financial markets the world over. So there are ways that we can fight back. And look, not all of them are easy, but we have to understand how capitalists wield their power so that we can combat it. So there's one tactic that we can use, especially in combating capital flight, and that is reintroducing capital controls, which essentially are a system of taxes and limitations on international transfers of wealth. Understand this. Capital controls aren't some radical communist idea. Liberal governments the world over have used them, just following Keynesian economics. In fact, capital controls were the norm established from Bretton Woods, which was a system of monetary management that was created after World War II, an agreement between the major Western European economies, North American economies, and Japan. This was the norm in very recent history. But let's not misunderstand this either. Capital controls are not some silver bullet. Sometimes they work, and sometimes they can be disastrous. But their eradication as the norm in 1974, look, there is no accident that this shift ties together with the global rise of neoliberalism. Their eradication is proof of the stranglehold that capitalists have on democracies across the globe. We can't even try it. It's not even on the agenda of most reformist parties. We are in another economic crisis, and the government in the United States has moved with historic speed to deliver stability to the rich and to the financial system. Did they get anything in return for it? Did you? This was not the final crisis, and it will not be the last. Contrary to their arguments, the wealthy need the government. They needed to provide them with economic relief to create the conditions in which they prosper and to protect their wealth. Now, the leadership of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have shown time and time again that they have no real interest in challenging this power dynamic. But they certainly could. And we have to build working class political movements that can not only demand, but force their demands to be met in the future. The current system is unsustainable, ecologically, morally, and economically. This crisis has only shown the immense power of the rich to demand and dictate terms to the government in a so-called democracy. Make no mistake about it. These crises are economic, but they have their foundation in a crisis of democracy, and we need to change that.